Mine is a simple, relatively privileged story of personal change. My own personal adaptation since I immigrated to the United States. A white male from Italy with an advanced degree. As a child, I liked books and asking questions. And when I learned to speak English, I was happy I could do that with an accent, but in another language. I decided to move to this country powered by dreams of personal achievement and the legendary trips, stories of a legendary trips that my dad took in 1974 to California. I brought with me a miniature model of a Roman ship built my grandfather, many books, and several cans of tuna that my man provided for the long flight. Tough to live outside of your culture, of your identity. I took it as an experiment. Improvisational skills, hope, and openness helped. I love freedom. And I have to be honest at the risk of being corny. I'm a proud American citizen. 43 different nationalities in my citizenship ceremonies. Have you ever attended one yourself? In uninspiring times of public life, I remind myself that I do live in the land of the free, in a land of immigrants, in the land of the brave. Because it takes bravery to immigrate. It takes bravery to change. America is a country of change, a place of possibilities, of new dreams, where we still feel the pull of idealism that David sometimes can beat Goliath. A place of impossible dreams coming true, like the dream of changing your own life. Universities teach us to be realist, rationalist, skeptical. We have models, frameworks about change. And I often wonder if this is the right mindset when we're dealing with challenges like changing our own life. Maybe we need bounded rationalities, but maybe we need more. Maybe we need big questions. Questions that we ask without hope for an answer. Questions that we ask while we figure things out. My friend David would call those living questions. Questions that we ask not to get an answer, but to live in the answer. Questions that we ask while we try to figure things out, while we try stuff. In times of change, we need living questions to live in the answer. Questions like, what do I want to be when I grow up? Or, what are my values in these times of shifting political sands? Or, what are the possibilities for the future of these organizations? Questions of acceptance and possibilities. We ask questions of acceptance and possibilities in Designing Personal Change, an executive education course that I teach at Johns Hopkins Carey Business School. And we ask questions of this kind as well as focusing more on unlearning rather than learning, more on insight rather than knowledge, more on empathy rather than determination. As we try to uncover this mystery that unfolds in our lives, in personal and organizational, that we call change. So, what is adaptive change? Adaptive change is about asking a simple living question. What is essential and defines me? And what is expendable and can be discarded? It's about learning to say yes and learning to say no. We can move into the future only if we let go elements from our past. Personal adaptive change is about sifting through our own life, keeping what is important from our past and discarding what is not. Now, this process is known and conscious, but its impact is not. And so sometimes a person or a relationship or a place that used to have meaning for us reveal to us how much we have changed. It could be a house. We used to live there and we loved it. We now go back and it irritates us strangely. Or a country you used to live. You go back, you don't feel at home anymore. Or a friend that shows up after many years that all of a sudden relates to you as the person you once were. You feel uncomfortable with that. Or people in the workplace. You go back after a life-changing event and you struggle to readjust. Now, all those situations, they all give us a glimpse of personal adaptive change. Personal adaptive change, glimpse of what our change has happened in the past. David Kolb once said, learning is about making the familiar strange and the strange familiar. We go back to our past with our new self and our old self. But our old self is no longer familiar. It's no longer us. How many times have you experienced your old self as no longer familiar? How many times have you experienced your old self as no longer familiar? Have you ever thought how much your life has changed and is changing right now? How much you have changed in the last 10, 15 years? Do you ever think of your life as an unfinished work of art, as an ongoing process, as a work in progress? Have you ever experienced yourself as no longer familiar? Think about yourself from 10, 15 years ago. Would you even recognize your own self from 10, 15 years ago? And more importantly, what would you tell them? Imagine the situation. You're walking in the street, and as you move, you come and you see yourself from 10, 15 years ago coming the other way. What would you tell them? One line. Now, this is important. What would you tell them? What would be one line? I want to engage some of you and ask, if you can tell me, what would you tell your younger self from 10, 15 years ago that you would randomly meet in the street? Anyone?
Run. The opposite direction, run.
Anyone else?
Oh, you've changed, you look much older.
Keep striving, you'll be okay.
Thank you. Well, think about it. Those of you that didn't have a chance to say, were you encouraging with your older self? Were you nice? Or were you somehow condescending? You know, those of us that work, we forget. We forget the pain that we went through to actually become who we are. Those of us that work in leadership and change, we tend to talk in great and optimistic terms about the possibilities for change. And we often fail to have enough respect for the pain of adjustment, and the dynamics of losses that changes bring. Rather than reverence, we talk about change in pretty optimistic terms. And we refer to the dynamics of not changing in pretty disrespectful ways. We call it resistance if it's organizational change. And what we mean really is the enemy. And even when it's personal change, and we are ourselves on the other side of this crafted change, we don't hesitate to call us lazy or selfish. But everybody is only relating to what they have and to what they consider as precious. And who would not resist when something precious is taken off our hand? People don't hate change. People hate losses. What does compassionate change look like? How can we become more compassionate during times of change? There are not definite answers to these questions. We do know that in this tricky terrain we need wisdom, but not so much conventional wisdom, our own. I have two things that I've learned in my life about personal change, but they don't come from journals, they don't come from magazines or books. The first one, my friend Steve taught me this in a time where I was struggling to adjust to a new way of living in the United States. Acceptance is the beginning of change. How can we, during tough times, stay anchored to an evolving but basic faithfulness to ourselves? How can we accept and deal with the losses that our own change brings without losing ourselves in the process? Acceptance is the beginning of change. In other words, how do we become more resilient? What if we become more resilient? The second one, I knew intuitively until Ron, a mentor that I owe so much, named it for me. Relearning is the work of change. Organizational learning and organizational change and personal change is all about relearning. Organizational change and personal change is relearning. How do we move from an entrenched set of identities into a more open and experimental mindset? How can we fight for what is right and hold on and be open to other values so that we can consider them? Relearning is the work of change. In other words, how can we be more spacious? What if we can be more spacious? Social activists, CEO, consultant, students, or anyone who is trying to lose 5 pounds knows very well how tricky the world of change is. Conspiring forces are there to try to make you lose ground. Try to understand those traps, those forces, and maybe we can master the cognitive and emotional thrust to counter them. But it's tricky. It takes much more than a pep talk. It takes discipline. The first one, the I'm right trap, the righteousness trap. A quick survey. How many here thinks to be wrong in the present? You know, everybody always thinks to be wrong in the past. Never in the present. How many change initiatives are actually all about explaining to the troops the righteousness vision of the CEO? But in order to change others, we need to change ourselves. We change ourselves if we avoid the I'm right trap. To avoid the I'm right trap, we need to hold what we know lightly. We need to embrace community. We need to embrace unlearning. We need to work with others. The second trap, the dynamic disequilibrium. Everything changes so that nothing changes. Like a rubber band, we are actually moving slowly back to where we started. We think we have changed, but we are exactly back at our starting point. We avoid the dynamic disequilibrium, when we actually gain a full understanding of those forces that are at play. And the third trap, the competing commitments. I want this, I want this, I want this, I want this. We commit to change, but simultaneously we are committing to this and to this and to many other things. We commit to change and inadvertently we prevent change, like a car with a brake, pushing the brake and pushing the accelerator. There is no movement. We deal with the competing commitment, getting a clear understanding of those interfering, different commitment. So, in summary, to become a more resilient and spacious version of yourself, keep asking living questions. Questions like, what is the living question that is animating my life right now? Avoid those three traps and let acceptance and relearning propel you towards your future. To become a more spacious, a more resilient version of yourself, find a purpose that you find compelling. Regain optimism about the possibility for personal and organizational change. And learn to say yes and learn to say no. Sociologists define our time as liquid modernity to explain that is this moment in which everything seems to be in a state of perpetual change. In a world, you can't hide from change. And we're all strangers in a strange land when it comes to change. In a world that screams for our attention, we can have the courage to learn like immigrants do. We can compose a life of personal adaptive change with passion and compassion, words that comes from the same Latin root, which is suffering, the pain that might come from becoming who we are. But uncertainty is just another name for possibilities. Thank you.